Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I love efficiency. I love things that are simple. I love things that are just straightforward and when things just work out really well. I'm fascinated by things like that. Don't get me wrong, I like some things that are complicated or messy, but sometimes when something is so simple, it can become a beautiful thing. And Gary sent me an email yesterday, and I looked at the email and I marveled at it. I thought to myself, this is the most brilliant email of all time. Gary, you are to be saluted for the email. The email was simply 7 words and a question mark. And it's a question that is a perfect topic for a video. And like I said, I get people sending me walls of text. I get people sending me all kinds of stuff. 7 words. Can surveyors trespass to do their job? That's all he wrote. Steve at LehtosLaw.com. Question. Can surveyors trespass to do their job? Gary. Brilliant. That's the question. And we've all seen survey crews out there. And we've also heard about problems with property lines. And there's all kinds of disputes that arise because of property lines. And so anyone who owns property presumably knows where the property lines are, but quite often the neighbor thinks the property line's someplace else, usually a few feet under your property. So once in a while, people say, I got my property surveyed. I've actually heard of somebody saying, I saw surveyors on my property. I wanted to kick them off. Can I? And well, I can tell you in Michigan, no. In Michigan, surveyors can trespass to do their jobs. Now, trespass, technically speaking, is an illegal entry onto someone else's property, but surveyors have got the right to enter property to survey as part of their job. If they couldn't, then the whole system would fall apart. So the Michigan legislature, and I suspect a lot of other states have done this too, passed a law specifically allowing surveyors to enter the property of others without their permission. They don't need their permission. They can do their jobs while surveying as long as they follow this statute. So the statute is called the Right of Entry by Surveyors. It's MCL 54.121 et sec. So it goes 121 through 124. And it's called the Right of Entry by Surveyors Act of 1976. So I suspect that prior to that, it was probably common law that they could, because it does not appear that this replaced any previous statutes. And if you think about this, if surveyors could not enter private property, they couldn't do their jobs. Because if you watch surveyors, they're often using these devices that are on tripods. And if I put the device over one of the points that is a corner of a piece of property, by definition, the other 2 legs are off the property. So they couldn't work unless they actually were doing something, which I've seen them use those too. But there's all kinds of equipment they've got to use, and it would be impossible to do their jobs if they weren't allowed to just minimally invasive step onto the property next door. This defines a surveyor as any one of the following. A surveyor employed by the government of the United States or this state, a person who is a land surveyor registered in this state, or a person who is under the direct supervision of a person who is a surveyor under A or B above, and is carrying on his person sufficient identification as to his employer. So it can be a government surveyor or a registered surveyor. So presumably surveyors who don't work for the government must get registered to be a surveyor. So if you're out on your property one day and you see a guy walking around with all the devices of surveyors, and he's on your property, you walk, excuse me, sir, what are you doing on my property? He says, well, I'm a surveyor. I'm doing something with the lot lines here. You have the right to say, can I see some identification? To see, in fact, he is a registered surveyor. But if the guy is, in fact, a registered surveyor, he's got the right to be there. Now, if he's a government surveyor, presumably he'll have ID also, and he's got a right to be there as well. So here is the right they have. And keep in mind, it's not an absolute right. They can't move onto your property and build a house there, but they've got the right to survey. So, right of entry. A surveyor may enter upon public or private land or water in this state except buildings for the purpose of making a survey. Notice that it says they can enter private lands or waters. First of all, say walk through a river, they can step out into a lake, except buildings. So they can't knock on your door and say, excuse me, we're running a survey, and the line goes right through your house. We're coming in. You cannot do that because it says except buildings. And it says for the purpose of making a survey. So if they're making a survey, they may enter upon public or private lands. If they're using a vehicle used for or during entry pursuant to this section shall be identified on the exterior by a proper and ethical sign listing name, address, and telephone number of the surveyor or firm. Now, I don't know what an ethical versus unethical sign is, other than I guess you couldn't put a sign on that says you are a surveyor if you're not, but the vehicle must be identified. So let's suppose you owned a big chunk of property, 160 acres out in the middle of nowhere. Somebody calls and goes, hey, there's some dude walking around your property. Something looks weird. So you go driving out there and you pull up and there's a vehicle parked there. Just a truck parked there. So you go walk around and you find the guy inside and you go, excuse me, sir, what are you doing on my property? Oh, I'm a surveyor. Really? Well, number one, your truck should be marked to indicate so. And number two, show me something that proves you either work for the state or you're a registered surveyor. And by the way, you'll notice that it does not say anywhere in the law here that they must identify themselves to you upon demand. It doesn't say that. However, I'm pointing out a concept where if you simply play these different scenarios out in your mind, you'll realize that if you're a surveyor and you don't want to live dangerously, you'll carry ID. Because a lot of the places they're surveying are out in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of landowners they don't take kindly to strangers wandering their property. So if you're wandering around out there and you go, oh, I'm a surveyor, and it doesn't look like you're a surveyor and your truck's not marked, you might want to whip out some identification real fast. You might want to. So a vehicle used for or during entry pursuant to the section shall be identified on the exterior. Now, it does say to be used for or during entry. So if the surveyor enters your property but the vehicle doesn't, so let's suppose they park the vehicle across the road and then they enter your property. Then technically the vehicle doesn't need to be marked, but they still need to be able to prove that they either work for the state, the Fed, or they're a registered surveyor of the state of Michigan. Now, here's the liability portion, because some people are going to ask, Steve, the surveyor comes on my property and starts messing stuff up. What then? Oh, they've got liability too. A surveyor making an entry shall be liable only for actual damage to crops or other property, or for actual damage due to negligence of the surveyor during the entry. So, actual damage, and it does talk about crops or other property, and it says that without anything regarding negligence. So let's suppose the surveyors come on and actually damage some of your property. You can go after them for that. Say, hey, they damaged my property. And negligence that causes damage, they're liable for also. So the guy drives the truck onto the property, the truck is properly marked, gets out of the truck, doesn't realize he didn't put it in park, truck rolls forward and smashes into a building, causes some damage. They cannot say, well, hey, I'm a surveyor. I'm allowed to do that. So they do face liability for actual damage to crops or property, or for actual damage due to negligence of the surveyor during the entry. And by the way, the surveyor, by his entry, shall forfeit any and all claim for damage or injury to his person and equipment while on the lands or waters, unless the damage or injury is caused by the intentional, tortious conduct of another. Tortious is a word derived from the word tort, T-O-R-T. Tort is the classification of wrongs that courts can address between people, not in a criminal fashion, but in a civil fashion. So negligence is a tort, and so on. So if a surveyor comes onto your property and he trips and falls and breaks his leg, he cannot sue you for the trip and fall saying your property has an uneven surface. Well, you see, you have to understand that's not an intentional tortious conduct example, okay? And the point they're trying to get at here is, many of you have heard that if someone comes onto your property, depending on how they get there, you might be liable for injury that befalls them. So for instance, if you own a business, people come into your business are business invitees. You owe business invitees a higher standard than somebody who's just lollygagging around a building that is not a business. And so if somebody walks into a supermarket, turns and goes down an aisle, and they slip and fall because there's something slippery on the surface there, there's a good chance that the store owner's going to get sued and say, you shouldn't have left something slippery on the floor. It depends on how long it was there and how it got there, but that's another story altogether. The point is that you can be sued for that. So you do not have to make your property surveyor-proof so as not to injure a surveyor who's out wandering around your property. The law says, yes, they can go in. You can't kick them off. You can't say they're trespassing. But likewise, they can't sue you and say, oh, by the way, back there, I was climbing over a log and I fell and I hit my head. You should have cleared that log out of the way. No, that is not tortious behavior that put the log there. So they can't do that. Now, obviously, if you saw a surveyor on your property and you're a little up there and you don't like having people on your property and you start chasing him to get him off your property and he's yelling at you going, I'm a surveyor, I work for the federal government, I've got proof right here, and you keep chasing him and he gets injured, it sounds like tortious conduct to me. So it's pretty straightforward. And this is one of these beautiful bills. And I know you're saying, Steve, wait, are you saying legislation can be beautiful? Yes, this is the entire statute right there. The entire statute, and yes, that's my chicken scratching there about Gary and his email, right there. The entire statute is right here. This is shorter than what's written on a big boy placemat. This is how legislation should be written. Okay? So once again, right of entry by surveyors answers the question, can surveyors trespass to do their job? Yes. It's not a trespass, but yes, they can go onto private property without the permission of the landowner. Landowner cannot kick them off legally. Surveyor is defined as somebody who works for the state or the Fed, surveying, or a registered surveyor. And then meanwhile, they have to identify their vehicle if their vehicle comes onto the property. And they're allowed to access these things and do their survey work, although they cannot enter buildings. And then if they cause any damage out there, they're liable for it, depending on what kind of damage it is. And they also waive their right to sue you, the landowner, because they entered and they're under this statute. So it's one of these statutes. It gives with the one hand, it takes away with the other. It balances this stuff out. If you don't like the risks that you take as a surveyor, don't be a surveyor. So unless it's a tortious conduct leading to the damage or injury, you lose your ability to claim, file a lawsuit, and you lose your ability to do that to get recovery for damage to your person or your equipment. So Gary, thanks for the brilliant email. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words. 7 words. It's all the email was. It was a thing of beauty and simplicity. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. If you could understand Morse code, a tap dancer would drive you crazy.